Chancellor, I want to start with what you said to the country back on June the 11th. Here's you.
I don't need to become Chancellor to know what a mess the government have made of public finances, of public services, and the fact that the tax burden is at its highest level in 70 years. We don't need higher taxes. What we need is growth. I don't want to, and I have no plans to increase any taxes beyond those which we have already set out.
Now, you specifically said you already knew everything you needed to know, yet on Wednesday you raised taxes by £40 billion. Why would a reasonable person believe a single word that you say in the next 15 minutes and that you'll stick to it?
I was wrong on the 11th of June. I didn't know everything, because when I arrived at the Treasury on the 5th of July, so just under a month after I said those words, I was taken into a room by the senior officials at the Treasury, and they set out the huge black hole in the public finances beyond which anybody knew about at the time of the general election, because the previous government hid it from the country, they hid it from Parliament, and indeed they hid it from the official independent forecaster, the Office of Budget Responsibility. And so when I went into that budget last week, I had to put our public finances back on a firm trajectory, because we saw in the previous Parliament what happens when government loses control of the public finances. And the first commitment we made in our manifesto was to bring stability back to the economy, and that's what I did on Wednesday.
OK, but before we go on to that, let's just deal, frankly, with the arithmetic here. Mm-hmm. You say that they told you there's this black hole.
Yes.
By your own account, the difference between that was something like 9-10 billion. You've added in pay settlements and so on, but you raised 40 billion. There is a huge difference between even the most extravagant interpretation of
let me break that down.
And what you have demanded from particularly employers.
Yeah, let me break that down. The inheritance that we faced on the 5th of July was a £22 billion black hole between the commitments the previous government had made and the revenue they had coming in. We published on Wednesday, alongside the budget, the hundreds of line-by-line account of how that £22 billion is made up. In addition to that, there was the unfunded compensation claims that we need to pay for the victims of infected blood and the Post Office Horizon scandal. And then the third thing is that the previous government hadn't done a spending review since 2021. And so the outlook for public services, particularly our NHS and schools, would mean big cuts to public spending, and we would not be able to get those waiting lists down. But so that is why we had to raise taxes by £40 billion this week.
Some of that £40 billion is choices that you yourself made, and I want to come back to that. But let me just start, ask you about the difference between before the election and after the election. For example, before the election, you voted for 2 separate cuts to national insurance rates. Now that you've seen those numbers, was that a mistake?
Well, they were sold on a false premise, the premise being that the money was available. The money clearly wasn't available. That's what the £22 billion black hole was. Now, we could have on
But at the time, you gave them hell over it. You said you shouldn't do this. You still voted for it.
No, I didn't. I supported those cuts to national insurance because they were costed and funded. But now what we find out after the election is that the numbers didn't add up because the government hadn't revealed to the Office of Budget Responsibility or Parliament the gap between the commitments they were making and the money they had coming in. So those cuts to national insurance were on a false premise. Now, Trevor,
So the fact that you changed your position from then to now was not your mistake, it was just that Tories lied. That's all that happened here.
There was a massive cover-up,
You didn't make a mistake.
Trevor, there was a massive cover-up. The Office of Budget Responsibility set some of that out on Wednesday, and we have now published a line-by-line account of how that £22 billion is made up. Now, I had 2 choices on Wednesday, Trevor. The first was whether I was going to be responsible and put all that information out there or not. And you have to
Okay.
if you want to bring stability back. And the
All right.
second is how to close that gap. I've made my choices. I've
Okay.
put forward those tax increases. If people disagree, that's fine and reasonable, but they'll have to explain how they would make that money
Okay,
up.
I want to talk about the future, and I want to talk about your choices. And I'd just like to get one thing clear straight away. Will your promise not to raise rates on income tax, VAT, or employees' national insurance hold good for the whole of this Parliament?
Yes, absolutely. It was our manifesto commitment not to increase those three taxes. So income tax, employee national insurance and VAT. And we won't increase those. Now, you just asked
And there are
me...
no circumstances on which it will go up. The reason, you understand why I'm asking you this, because people are going to be a bit nervous. She said this before, then she discovered it was a problem. Will we discover in 2 years' time that there's some reason why they've got to go up?
No.
Or is this an absolute commitment?
It's an absolute commitment. But let me just say this. We've now wiped the slate clean under the mismanagement and the chaos of the previous government. It's now on us. We've put everything out into the open.
Okay.
We've set the spending envelope for the course of this Parliament. We don't need to come back for more. We've done that now. We've wiped the slate clean.
So you're saying, actually, there's not going to be an Oliver Twist moment. You're not going to come back and say, we want another tax rise. Or if you did, that would be a huge failure for your government, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to be able to write 5 years' worth of budgets on this show today, but what we have
I'm just
done...
saying, will there be more tax rises?
No, you're right, Trevor. There is no need to come back with another budget like this. We never need to do that again. We've now, Trevor, set the spending envelope for the remainder of this Parliament. We don't need to increase taxes further. We need to do two things now. We need to reform our public services to make sure they work better, and we need to grow our economy.
I'm going to come to that.
Those are the two key things that I'm going to focus on now.
Indeed, I want to come to both those things. But before we do that, I just want to ask you about this. You're covering the rise employers' national insurance rates for civil servants and for the NHS, but not for GPs or for care homes or for hospices. Are you going to cover the cost for those employees? Are you going to change your mind about that? Or are you going to, as some of the employers in hospices and care homes say, are you going to put end-of-care, life care at risk for thousands of people in those hospices and care homes?
What the tax increases on Wednesday paid for, in part, was a £22.6 billion investment into the National Health Service. And the National Health Service will now make the allocations to GPs, for example. And so that will be done in the normal way. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, will do that later this year. But I'm confident
and the
that we've put our money...
and care homes which are private?
Well, those are matters for the NHS to make the allocation of money to, for example, hospices as well as GP surgeries. But there's enough money now in the NHS budget to fund those priorities.
So absolutely, you're not making money, but you would expect the NHS to make up the gap for some of these employers, hospitals, care homes and so on.
Well, care homes got in the budget on Wednesday a £600 million settlement. Local government got 3.2% increase, so above inflation, real terms increase in spending this week. So I'm confident that those services will carry on running properly. But the point of the tax increases was to fund more appointments in our NHS, more teachers in our schools and more houses being built.
You've used two words there. One is growth and the other one is your choices. Now, let's talk about growth. You won't be delivering any, but let's have a look at what the OBR says, that actually growth is going to go up a bit for a couple of years, and then it's going to settle, 1.5%. Actually, you've already failed. There isn't going to be the growth that you promised.
Well, I'm not satisfied with those numbers. Those aren't the summit of my ambition, but we're less than 4 months into
the OBR wrong?
Government. No, the OBR aren't wrong. They have factored in the things that we have already announced. But, of course, we've got more to do on growing our economy. That's why we've already published a green paper on our modern industrial strategy. It's why we are reviewing the planning system to get Britain building again. It's why in my first week I announced a review of the pension system to unlock long-term patient capital for businesses. I'm determined to grow the economy.
Are you disappointed by those figures?
I'm not satisfied with those numbers. I want economic growth to be stronger and faster, and I want it to be felt by people all around the country. Just a couple of weeks ago, Trevor, we hosted, let me just make this point. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted our International Investment Summit, and businesses announced £63.5 billion of investment into the UK. After the budget, another company, Prologis, announced £500 million of investment into a biomedical science park. I want growth to be faster. I think we can grow our economy faster than those numbers, and that's my job now to get those growth numbers up.
The problem is that this isn't going to be felt by people, is it? The crucial point is that over time, you want living standards to rise. But your own figures show that household incomes are just going to rise by 0.5% over the period. Per capita GDP, 1.1%. It is pretty feeble.
Well, those are real terms increases. And you'll know, Trevor, that in the last Parliament, GDP per capita was on a downward trajectory and real household disposable income was stagnant. The last Parliament was the worst Parliament on record.
Yeah, we keep going back to the awful Tories.
Yeah,
what you're offering is not much.
Increase. Well, 0.5% average per year, real growth in real household disposable incomes. Do I want to do more? Of course I do. That's why now that this budget is out of the way, we have now wiped the slate clean. The focus has got to be on reforming our public services to deliver better value for money and growing our economy to improve living standards.
Are you seriously going to say that 0.5% over this period is going to feel like a difference to the average? 0.5% per year is going to feel like a difference to the average household. Come on.
Yes, because in the last Parliament, living standards were stagnant. But do I want living standards to rise faster than that? Of course I do. I absolutely do, which is why we're putting focus now on Getting Britain building, unlocking that long-term patient capital for start-up businesses, working in partnership with business to unlock the huge opportunities. My ambition for Britain has never burned brighter. We now need to deliver against the opportunity that we have.
The phrase that kept recurring in your budget speech was tough choices. Let's examine that. You made, you say, a tough choice by raising £25 billion in tax from employers through the national insurance increase. But in fact, you've left it to businesses to decide whether they pay that by cutting jobs, cutting wages, or cutting investments. You didn't make the choice at all. You've outsourced it to employers. You made the easy choice, not the tough one.
Well, we made a choice to ask employers to pay higher national insurance rather than putting that directly on employees. So as a result of our budget choices, no one will see higher taxes in their pay slip as a result. And yes, businesses will now have to make a choice, whether they will absorb that through efficiency and productivity gains, whether it will be through lower profits or perhaps through lower wage growth. But overall, if you look at the package...
They won't hire new workers?
Well, if you look
They won't hire new workers? Trevor, they won't give pay rises? They're the ones who are making the tough choice, not you.
Trevor, let me make this point. The Office of Budget Responsibility forecast during this Parliament that wages increase and that employment increases. So you're taking one part of the budget, but if you look, for example, at parts of the budget that increase capital investment in our economy, that crowds in private investment, grows our economy and creates more jobs. So if you look at the package as a whole, it is good for employment growth and wages growth.
Can you put yourself in the seat of a small employer who's having to pay the Small Businesses Association says something like £500 or £600 more for an employee? He or she has to pay that money. But you've exempted the government from having to pay that national insurance rise. So actually, everybody else has to pay the money, but you, the government employer, actually gets away with it.
Well,
Can you see how that feels to an employer?
Let me say two things. The point of this budget was, first of all, to make sure our public finances are on a solid footing. That's incredibly important for business because business in the last Parliament were hit by the instability and chaos. But also, let me say this too, that the smallest businesses are exempt from the increases in national insurance.
You take about 1 million businesses out of 5 million.
No, around half of businesses will be paying either less or the same amount in national insurance. If you are a small business and you're employing, say, 4 people at the national living wage, you won't pay any national insurance at all,
All right.
that's a cut in your national insurance.
Let me ask you about another choice that you did not make. There hasn't been an uprating of council tax since 1991. London properties sell for about 7 times as much as they did then. So Londoners are underpaying tax. People in the north, and particularly in the northeast, where you're an MP,
Yorkshire,
are now are now overpaying. Why did you dodge tackling the council tax? You've got a majority of 170. You've got 4 years. Couldn't be a better time to fix that problem that governments have dodged time and again.
Well, that's a very complicated and tricky issue to address, and it would result in some people paying significantly more in tax.
Yeah, what happened to tough choices?
Well, I think we made plenty of tough choices in the budget this week, including the ones we've just gone through on employer NICs. I think it was the right approach to ask the wealthiest and to ask business to pay a bit more, to put our public finances on a firm footing, and to ensure that we have the appointments in our NHS that we need and the teachers in our schools that we need.
But this particular thing is not on the never-never. This is not a big thing. This is not a thing that's going to recede into the future. Councils currently are declaring the Section 114. You know this, the equivalent of bankruptcy. You're going to have to bail them out at some point. Why have you dodged this particular choice, which you actually, amongst other politicians, have been saying for years we've got to tackle?
Well, for local authorities, we've done a couple of key things. First of all, 3.2% increase, real terms increase in their budgets. But also, for the first time, councils will be able to keep their right to buy receipts to invest in new social housing, which is a huge benefit to local authorities.
But this is small,
and indeed, people... No, Trevor, I wouldn't accept that. It will contribute towards the 1.5 million homes that we want to build during the course of this Parliament by giving local authorities the chance to keep those receipts and invest in new social housing.
All right. There's one last thing on the horizon which will present you, I think, with a choice. If Mr Trump becomes president again and delivers on his promise of 20% tariffs on all imported goods, first of all, have you actually asked the Treasury to model that prospect? And if he does, what will you do?
Well, it's up to the American people to decide who they want to vote for in their elections.
What will you do?
Next week. We are an open trading economy. The US is our single biggest trading partner, more than £300 billion of trade between our countries. That's beneficial for the UK, but it's also beneficial for the United States. And so we will work with whoever becomes president and make the case for that free and open trade that we believe in.
So you wouldn't... There wouldn't be a response. You haven't modelled it. And what you're telling me is actually you wouldn't respond with anything, any kind of protection?
Well, of course, we look at all eventualities of what might happen in the election this week, but we will make the case for free trade, for open trade. I think it's beneficial not just to the UK, but to America too. And the bonds between our country are as strong as they have ever been.
Chancellor, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.